Welcome to the online Targeted Grazing Workshop for 2015. The series was created by the Targeted Grazing Committee of the Society for Range Management. We put together 5 modules on the topic of targeted grazing for vegetation management and landscape enhancement. Today we'll have the chance to view and hear Module 2, Plant Ecology and Plant Response to Grazing. Today's information on plant ecology and response to grazing will be presented by Dr. John Hendrickson. Dr. Hendrickson is a rangeland scientist at the Northern Great Plains Research Laboratory in Mandan, North Dakota. This laboratory is a unit of the USDA Agricultural Research Service. Dr. Hendrickson got his PhD from Texas A&M, and most of his work has been focused on plant response to disturbance. Currently, he's working on research involving targeted grazing for invasive grasses such as Kentucky bluegrass and others. And he's also an author of the chapter on plant response to grazing in the Targeted Grazing Handbook. So with that, I will let John take it over and tell us about ecology and response to grazing.
All right, and again, I would like to thank everyone for joining us on this webinar today. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about plant ecology, and because I think when we look at targeted grazing, part of it is the animal part, but the other half is we're looking at these plants. You really want to understand a little bit about their ecology in order to understand how they might respond to targeted grazing. And so the other part to that is how are these plants going to respond to grazing? Karen said I'm John Hendrickson. I work with the USDA Agricultural Research Service, and I'm currently with the Northern Great Plains Research Lab in Mandan, North Dakota. The first thing I'm going to talk a little bit about today is competition. And really, when you look at targeted grazing or burning or any time we try to manipulate competition, one of the things we're really trying to do is change those competitive interactions so they favor species we want and don't favor species we don't want. And this is some data from the sheep experiment station in Dubois, Idaho, and it's from 1972, but boy, it really shows the impact of competition quite well. And I'm going to draw your attention to the graph on the left side of the screen. And if you look, there are 3 levels of competition: no competition, partial competition, and full competition. And with each of those levels, there are 3 different levels of clipping: a no clipping, a heavy clipping, and an extreme clipping. And on this graph here, you can see that extreme clipping with no competition has about the same level of biomass as no clipping with partial competition. So basically what that says is partial competition impacted the level of biomass to the same degree as extreme clipping did. And on the right side, we see something similar. It's not quite as dramatic, but we can see the impact of competition on flower stalks too. So at the end of it, competition is a very powerful force, and it's one that we probably don't appreciate quite as much, but it can really help shape our vegetative community, so we need to use it. The idea of competition, as I said, is to enhance desired plants and to weaken target species or undesired plants. And just as an example of it, there was a study looking at spotted knapweed, and they basically looked at biocontrol. In this case, it was a couple insect biocontrol species. And they found that when they added competition, that is some sort of plant competition to the biocontrol, they ended up decreasing spotted knapweed growth even more. And it's important to recognize because targeted grazing is long-term. It's not a one-shot deal. It's not like a herbicide that you can go out and spray and, plants are dead. It's a long-term thing. You have to go back repeatedly, as John Walker said last time. And over the time, what you want to do is keep shaping this competitive interaction so they benefit a lot of the plants that you're looking for. The other part to this is targeted grazing is targeted grazing. And one of the ways what grazing does is it helps to shift plant competition. And this is a paper that was done, it was kind of interesting. It was actually done in the eastern part of the United States. In Canada, which there's not a lot of, invasive plant papers done there. But this was interesting, and actually looks at two what we would call exotic plants. Some of them are invasive, and some of them are non-invasive. And basically, the plants that were invasive, if you look at the graph here, this is percent of leaf damage, and the non-invasive plants were grazed much more than the invasive plants. So basically, grazing was helping to keep a lot of the invasive plants in check. So, as we look at grazing in plant response to grazing, we're kind of considering what we're really looking at is grazing resistance. Basically, plants, when they're grazed, and if you look at our plant communities, especially in the Great Plains or a lot of places where plants are grazed, it's somewhat amazing that a lot of our plants stay there. They're exposed to a lot of different disturbances. They're exposed to grazing. They're exposed to drought. They're exposed to fire. There's all these different things and I wonder, makes you ask the question, how do plants really persist in these environments? In grazing, we look at grazed plants, and we call these the ability of plants to persist in time. We call that grazing resistance. In other words, these are mechanisms that allow plants to survive when they're being grazed. And we basically split these mechanisms into two different portions. There's the avoidance mechanisms, and there's tolerance mechanisms. And kind of the way I like to look at that is avoidance mechanisms are ways that basically plants say, hey, I'm not going to be grazed. There's some way that they reduce how often they're grazed, the amount that they're grazed, the probability they're going to be grazed. So they kind of avoid grazing. The other way to look at it is sometimes plants say, well, I'm going to get grazed, but I'm going to respond well after I get grazed. And basically, these are tolerance mechanisms. These are mechanisms that help to increase growth following grazing. What are some of these mechanisms? Well, let's look at avoidance mechanisms first. And we split these into different categories, again, within avoidance mechanisms. And the first category is mechanical. Basically, these are things like thorns, prickles, spines. Grazing animals are a lot like us. If you get poked in the face a lot, you don't want to go back, even if it's a nice green bark. And, animals are the same way. If they get poked, there's some way that the plant is protecting it with some sort of defense, then they try not to graze those. And in some cases, these defenses are what we call inducible. In other words, they are induced by grazing. What are some of these? Well, some of these are growth form. For example, bunch grasses. There is for example, in the Great Plains, there's little blue stem, which is a bunch grass. There's crested wheatgrass, which is a non-native bunch grass. These grasses grow in a bunch, and oftentimes there are stems there that livestock don't like to stick their heads down through in order to eat. There are also other plants that grow low to the ground. For example, blue grama, or if you go to the southern Great Plains, curly mesquite. These plants basically grow low to the ground, and because they grow low to the ground, they have what we call a prostrate growth form, which means that it's hard for the animal to eat a large amount of that plant. So in other words, rather than maybe eating, grazing it and removing 75% of the biomass, plants that are grow low to the ground, the animal grazes it. Maybe they're only physically able to remove 25% of the biomass. Another way that plants avoid grazing is plant size. I did my PhD research in the hill country of Texas, and I looked at Zytosperma was a plant that I looked at, and we tried to understand some of the ways that grazing impacted cytospora. And on the research center we worked at there, it was the Sonora Research Station, they had a series of grazing intensity experiments that had been set up over a long period of time. And basically with cytospora, the higher the grazing intensity, the smaller and more dispersed were the bunch grasses, in this case cytospora. What happens with that is that with those more dispersed bunch grasses, it's really hard for the animal to graze enough of any one. The probability of them being grazed is reduced because they're smaller and they're so spread out. Another way that plants avoid grazing is the location of meristems. Basically, meristems are ways that the plants reproduce. Classic example of this is grasses. Grasses often put their meristems very low to the ground. They're often on the crown of the grass plant, which is right at or slightly below the soil surface. And because of that, it's really hard for the grazing animal to reach. And the final thing is there is a ratio of live to dead culms or shoots. And it kind of goes back to the bunch grass form where you have this live dead ratio, or there's dead stems that are up there, and it makes it less attractive. They don't like to graze as much of that because there's a mixture of live and dead shoots within that, what they're eating. So they do try to avoid grazing that. This slide here shows growing points. And if you can see down here, this is what we would call an axillary bud. This here is a tiller, a grass tiller that's just emerging. And in a lot of areas, for example, the Great Plains, if you look at grass reproduction, over 95% of it is from axillary buds. And so, the ability of grasses to produce seeds, well, they can produce seeds. That contribution to their persistence over time is relatively limited. This looks with a tree or shrub, and again, in this case, rather than growing close to the ground to protect it, the growing points are protected with stems or thorns. You can see right in here there's leaves. There's these dry branches that are protecting some of the growing points. Again, it makes it very hard for the animal to access those areas. We talked about basically physical barriers that are avoidance strategies. There's the other category, which is biochemical. And these kind of work in two different ways. First of all, in some cases, they reduce digestive benefit. What that means is the animal doesn't get the benefit out of it, so it starts to reduce its preference for a certain species. The other is they can actually have a negative feedback. In this case, they eat something, it causes a bad reaction for them, and it creates an aversion, or the animal doesn't like to eat that plant because of its previous associations with that plant. So we talked a lot about grazing resistance and split them into the two mechanisms here. Now we're going to look a little bit more about how we can use grazing and some of the impacts that it has on the communities. This is grazing tolerance. And in this case, I skipped a whole category here. In this case, sometimes plants tolerate grazing. That means they utilize their resources to regrow after grazing. There's a couple ways they can do this. Again, there are morphological and there are physiological components to this. The morphological are things like this leaf replacement potential. Leaves on plants are kind of their solar panels, so the way they collect energy. And if they can replace those quickly, if they have a lot of those that they can replace quickly, then they can tolerate grazing better. Another way is the meristematic potential for growth. Do they have a lot of meristems down there that they can activate quickly and use to respond after a grazing event to regrow their photosynthetic tissue again? The other way is physiological. There is this concept of compensatory photosynthesis. What that means is after the plant gets grazed, plant may increase its photosynthetic rate to try to make up for the loss of some of that tissue that was removed. There are all other things with carbon allocation patterns. And it's kind of interesting. The one thing is that, oftentimes it's how the plant allocates its carbon that's really important, almost more so than potentially maybe the amount of carbon that it has. And so what it does for those, does it use it for root growth? Does it allocate it to tiller growth so it can regrow quickly afterwards? That has a lot of impacts on how well it's going to respond or tolerate grazing. This is kind of a classic study, and it was done by Dr. Caldwell at Utah State University. And I want to draw your attention here to this lower graph. And basically, this is the number of regrowth tillers. This study looked at two different grasses. A desitorin is crested wheatgrass. It's a non-native. It was introduced here from Eurasia. The second grass is blue bunch wheatgrass, and it is native grass. In both cases, they have a lot of taxonomic and morphological similarities, but crested wheatgrass can tolerate grazing much more than blue bunch wheatgrass can. Dr. Caldwell and his colleague asked, why is this? And they evaluated a number of different things, but one of the things that came out with was how well that crested actually allocated a lot of its resources into regrowing these tillers after it had been defoliated. You can see that crested has a lot more regrowth tillers than what blue bunch did. And it seemed like this allocation to regrowing tillers provided crested with a lot more photosynthetic capacity that really enhanced its ability to tolerate grazing. This table here looks at something similar, in this case, blue grama. Blue grama is interesting because it also is a very low-growing grass, and so it kind of has that avoidance mechanism of the prostrate growth form. But it's also interesting to look at how it actually allocates a lot of its resources once it is grazed. In this case, the top line is an undefoliated plant. The bottom line is a defoliated plant. The red numbers are the percent of total growth that's allocated to different portions of the blue grama plant. For example, the leaf blades, some of the sheaths, as well as the roots. Basically, when blue grama is defoliated, about 53% of its new growth goes to leaf blades. Comparing that to an undefoliated plant, where only 33% of the new growth goes into leaf blades. However, an undefoliated plant puts a lot more into root growth compared to a defoliated plant. So these ways that after defoliation plants allocate carbon resources also have a high degree of importance in determining how well they're going to tolerate grazing. This is kind of a classic picture here, and I think it shows the impact of grazing on root growth visually just about better than anything else I've seen. And you can kind of see that these different levels of removal, the impact it has on below ground biomass. And it's important to recognize it, especially in grasses. A lot of our grasses, at least 50%, sometimes up to 80% of the total biomass is below ground. And so when you're removing that below, basically the above ground biomass, you're also impacting the below ground biomass that has a large ability on the ability of that plant to persist in disturbance following the grazing. Root growth basically decreases proportionally as defoliation removes greater than 50% of the plant. area. In other words, we often in range talk about this take half and leave half idea. Well, one thought behind that is the fact that, or one of the ideas behind that was this idea that if you graze more than 50% of the leaf area, you really start to lose a lot of your root growth area. And not only is this impact as far as the amount that you remove, but it's also important to realize the frequency of defoliation. So between the frequency and the intensity, this determines the total impact of defoliation on the root growth. So grazing has a lot of different impacts on plants, and this is something that some of this information came from Dr. Mark Kothman at Texas A&M University. And, you know, a lot of these impacts are negative. Grazing removes photosynthetic tissues. When you graze, you remove the leaf blades. Those photosynthetic tissues are, like I said earlier, the solar. They're the way that the plant gets energy. When you remove those, the plant has to use stored carbohydrates to replace them. If meristems are elevated, they can be grazed also. What that means is when that meristem is removed, the ability of the plant to continue growth is also reduced. And so if you remove those meristems, you can delay or stop growth. Finally, especially in forbs, if you can, oftentimes their ability to reproduce is more through flowers and seeds. And if you remove those flowers and seeds, you remove a lot of the ability to produce new individuals. However, having said all that, is that grazing is a very natural ecological process. A lot of the northern Great Plains, for example, was developed under grazing. The Great Plains in general, all were developed under grazing. And overgrazing occurred prior to humans. There's a lot of historical records talking about the impact bison had on the plant community. And so to consider that is that, properly managed grazing, is very sustainable. But as you look at it, destructive grazing can occur, but the key to it is understanding the impact of grazing, and so that you can have a sustainable level of grazing rather than a destructive level. So now I think we're done with grazing resistance and avoidance mechanisms, and we're going to move on a little bit to how you can use these within a plant community. This slide here shows an area in Montana. This data came from Montana State University, I think the Montana Sheep Institute. And to me, this is a really interesting slide for a couple reasons. First off, the big yellow area here is leafy spurge. The green area on the bottom is grass. This is kind of like pounds per acre. So it kind of gives a good idea on how much of your total production is leafy spurge, how much is grass. If you look, there's a small line in between here that's blue. These are the forbs. You can see as you go on this side from a low level of spurge infestation to a high level of spurge infestation, that basically the amount of total biomass that you get from grass is flipped. In other words, it's probably about 70% of the total biomass comes from grass at the low level. If you go to the high level, about 70% of your total biomass comes from leafy spurge. It's interesting to see that the total biomass is, in this case, is not really impacted by the presence of leafy spurge. Total biomass is the same. It's just the composition of that biomass is changed. This slide here also shows, and so if we keep this in mind, we look at forage production. This is again from the Spotted Knapweed project, and this in Montana. And in 2004, they looked at this site, and they had a total forage production of 620 pounds per acre. That total forage production, about 2/3 of it was spotted knapweed. 25% of the production was grass. After 2 years of sheep grazing, total forage production was reduced down to 465 pounds, but grass production had doubled. It went from about 154 pounds per acre to almost 300 pounds per acre, whereas spotted knapweed production had been decreased by 2/3. So basically they used grazing, in this case with sheep, to help shift the competitive interaction over to favor grasses over the spotted knapweed. So basically the idea there, as we saw in the previous slide, is to replace the invasive plants with something that's a more desirable plant community. However, it's important to remember that this does not always occur. This is some data from eastern Montana, and basically what the authors did here, and this again was a biocontrol study, but they asked the question, what happens when, in this case, leafy spurge is removed? If you look at the left-hand side of your graph, you'll see that there's a couple releases of a biocontrol agent that really reduce the amount of leafy spurge in the plant community. And then they asked the question, what happens after that? So they had some other plant communities that were similar to, as far as soils, aspect, slope, their grazing history, that were similar to the communities that had the leafy spurge, but in these communities had not been impacted by leafy spurge. And they compared these two communities. So on the right side of this slide, you'll see a non-infested, which means there was limited leafy spurge community. And they list a series of grasses and forbs here. If there's a star next to it, it is a introduced or non-native. And they looked at these over time, and in 2003 and in 2005 and 2006, and you can see there's a lot of plant diversity. The majority of that plant diversity are native plants. And you compare to that to the community that had been heavily impacted by the leafy spurge. Even though leafy spurge declined, a lot of the plants, that community, the biomass that replaced that leafy spurge was non-native. In this case, some non-native poa species, as well as some hawkweed and other things that, were not desired within the community. What that means is just because you remove the weed or the target species, you need to understand what is the potential there to fill in the void afterwards. In rangeland health, they talk an awful lot about thresholds, and it's important to understand with targeted grazing also. If you graze and you move some of these communities past the threshold, or these communities have moved past the threshold before you grazed them, their ability to get back to a more, what NRCS calls relic community, is really compromised. And so these are things you need to consider when you are considering a targeted grazing program. So what you really want to do is you want to load the deck in your favor. You want to understand the animal and have the animal at its best. And you want to have enough idea about plant ecology so you can attack that target plant at its most susceptible phase. To do this, you look at a series of grazing strategies. And you want to do a couple things to these grazing strategies. A, you want to hurt the target plant. Second thing is, it doesn't do any good to hurt the target plant if you damage the desired species. So you want to limit the damage to the surrounding vegetation or the desired vegetation. It's something that has to be consistent with your livestock production goals, and it has to be integrated with other control methods. So it's basically a pest management strategy. We're going to look at this in two ways. First of all, what I'm going to talk about for the rest of this talk is looking at the timing and the intensity defoliation. These two things really relate to plant ecology. In the next couple webinars, Karen Launchbaugh and Rachel are going to talk about the herbivore and how you select the herbivore and the different species, breeds, background, condition, and age, and these all relate to animal husbandry. So the first thing we're going to talk about is timing. And this, again, is a photo at the U.S. Sheep Experiment Station. And on the right side of the photo, you can see a lot of arrowleaf balsam root, this yellow flower here. It is a fall graze pasture. Well, the balsam root has a tendency to graze in the spring, to bloom in the spring and grow rapidly in the spring. You can see with this fence line contrast, when we grazed it in the spring, we basically eliminated the spring forbs. So the season of grazing is critical when you're considering a grazing strategy. This looks at spotted knapweed. And the idea here is that, again, as you saw in the previous slide, that you can reduce a native forb, can you use this same idea to reduce a non-desired forb? In this case, we're looking at spotted knapweed. June here is about the bolting time for spotted knapweed in Montana. And you can see that if it was defoliated in June, which was during bolting, you saw almost a 90% reduction in the number of buds and flowers per plant compared to the control. And if you increase that and did it twice or three times, you just about totally eliminated bud and flower head production. But it's important to remember that if it was only that simple, because sometimes it's hard to get them to eat the invasive plant. So how do you do that? Well, you look at it and you try to realize, time your grazing to a point when weeds are most susceptible and are relatively palatable. At the same time, desired species are least palatable or least susceptible. So when we say relatively palatable, what we mean here is that how tasty are they compared to the surrounding vegetation? A lot of times, as we saw earlier, they're not grazed preferentially by herbivores. So we're looking at some time when their tastiness is about equal to the surrounding vegetation. So they're not going to avoid it. This just kind of looks at something like this with season of grazing. Maybe this is your weed plant, and you look and you see this is the spring, and you see green up, and the plant is increasing in susceptibility, as we saw with that previous slide up to seed set. But at the same time, as the plant gets older, there's certain chemical changes that occur within the plant that make it less and less palatable. So you're trying to graze about this time when you can maximize susceptibility and palatability at the same period. So kind of when those lines cross. So let's put it in a community standpoint, and let's start looking at weeds as well as desirable plants. And when are you going to graze those? So again, you want to look at susceptibility of your desirable plants and palatability of the desirable plants, again, and compare it to the weeds. So in this case, again, you might want to graze this early because your desirable plants are not as susceptible at that point, but the weeds still are very susceptible, and the palatability between the two, although the desired plants are a little bit higher palatability, it's about as close as you're going to get to the same palatability as the weeds that you want to remove for the undesired plants. And this is a list here with the season of grazing and when you might want to target these. And it shows that each of these are a little bit different. So you have to kind of understand what's going on. But with leafy spurge, it might be the late spring. And spotted knapweed, it might be the bolting or bud and flowering. But cheatgrass, which is a grass, it might be early spring. You know, you might want to graze that a little bit earlier because it's an annual, it has a tendency to senesce out and be less desirable the later in the year that it goes. So let's talk a little bit. This is a sheep grazing spotted knapweed, and this is in Idaho in Du Bois. And they looked at the season or the timing of grazing and the intensity. And they tried to do this to figure out how you could most effectively use sheep for spotted knapweed control. Basically, if you look at the relative proportion removed, sheep preferred knapweed over grass. And they actually increased the consumption the most in July when the knapweed was flowering. And that's the time in that area of Idaho when the grass is a little bit less desirable. It's starting to dry out, and it's senesced a little bit more. And it's a time period when the grass is less desirable. So you're seeing at that time removing a lot more of the spotted knapweed and a lot less of the grass. And this shows that when you graze these plants, and this is in meters squared, if you graze them at some time, whether in the rosette or bolt stage or flower stage, you actually start decreasing the number of knapweed flowers and the density. And so this is in plants per meter squared, and you can see the control here. In 2002, there was a lot fewer plants than what there was in 2001, but there is even a greater decline when you started looking at grazing at different stages. So basically, sheep grazing reduced spotted knapweed density. You know, this is, again, some data from Montana that we discussed earlier. But again, it looks like the impact of season on defoliation on reduction in seed production. And basically, if you grazed it in June, there's almost a 75% reduction. But if you increased and grazed it in July or August, when those spotted knapweed are putting on seeds and seed heads, or flowering and putting on seed heads, you almost had a 100% reduction in seed production. This is a yellow star thistle grazing study in Idaho. It had cattle, sheep, or none, and then it looked at 3 different phenological stages for yellow star thistle: rosette, which is this stage here, bolting, which is this stage here, or flowering, which is this stage here. Basically, what they found in this study that actually after 2 years, grazing by sheep during the flowering was really the only effective control for it. So we're talking a little bit about stocking rate and frequency, and this is really important. There's a study in Montana where they simulated grazing, but they looked at the time, intensity, and the frequency of grazing. And basically, depending on what they did on time, intensity, and frequency, they had 3 different outcomes. Either they didn't impact anything, they increased the invader and decreased some of the native species, or they decreased the invader and increased some of the native species. Basically, you can see that there are 3 different results there, and only the third one is one that you would want. And so it's really important to understand the intensity, time, and frequency in order to understand how to best utilize grazing as a tool. This is a study again with leafy spurge, and this looks at the frequency of defoliation and the number of stems with spurge only or spurge and other vegetation. You see, as you increase the frequency of defoliation and increase the utilization, you had the greatest reduction in leafy spurge stems per meter, when it was only by itself, and the same thing when it was with other vegetation. So in this case, both the intensity and the frequency were important components in trying to decrease leafy spurge density. So at the end of the time, you need to make the right decisions. When to graze, how long to graze, and with which critter. And with which critter is some of the stuff that's going to be talked about in the next several webinars. So just remember, it's not about weeds, it's about how you want the land to look. So with that, here's some references that we used in the talk. And so with that, I'm open to any questions.
Thanks to Dr. John Hendrickson for that great information on plant ecology in response to grazing. You can learn more about this topic and other topics related to target grazing from our Targeted Grazing website, which is at targetedgrazing.wordpress.com. There are 5 installments in this online workshop series, and all of these will be posted on this website as they become available. This information is brought to you by the Targeted Grazing Committee of the Society for Range Management, and we appreciate your interest in the topic. Please join us and respond to us through our email or through the website. Thanks.